OpenStax, Psychology, 2nd edition, Chapter 2, Psychological Research, narrated by Dr. Nani Azman, University of Hawai'i, Maui College, for Psychology 100, Survey of Psychology. If I were to ask a room of psychology students to come up with a potential research question in psychology, a popular question that is likely to come up is, how does television content impact children's behavior? In other words, does it make a difference if a toddler watches age-appropriate TV shows like the Mickey Mouse Club or Octonauts, or if they watch shows with adult content like The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel or Law & Order SVU? Why is research important? It used to be that people thought that the earth was flat, or that mental illness was actually possession by a ghost or spirit. Right now there are huge debates as to whether the COVID-19 vaccines are safe, or whether it's actually the government implanting you with a microchip to track your movements. As an aside, the vaccines are safe. Are they perfect? No, but nothing in the world is 100% safe. However, many of us opt to get vaccinated for the sake of those who are unable to be vaccinated, who we want to protect. And no, the government doesn't need to implant a microchip in you to track your movements. They can already track you through your cell phone. Back to the slide. Scientific research is empirical. It is grounded in objective, tangible evidence that can be observed time and time again, regardless of who is observing. Without research, we would only have intuition and groundless assumptions. Through research, we are able to prove certain ideas through study and testing. Psychology is a science. Therefore, research is required to not only further investigate something, but provide verification and support of the findings. Use of research information. Advertising campaigns often claim to be based on scientific evidence, when in reality it is based off belief. Whenever you hear a claim by advertisers or someone on the internet or down the street, you should think critically. Ask yourself, what is the expertise of the person making the claim? What might they gain if the claim is valid? Does this claim seem justified given the evidence? What do other researchers think of the claim? The process of scientific research, inductive versus deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning results are predicted based on general premise. For example, all living things require energy to survive, the premise. Ducks are living things, therefore ducks require energies to survive, conclusion. Inductive reasoning, on the other hand, conclusions are drawn for observations. You may see fruit growing on trees and therefore assume all fruit grows on trees. With deductive reasoning, you start with an overarching theory. With inductive reasoning, you start with pieces of information and are hoping to come up with a conclusion or theory that explains those pieces of information. So what Sherlock Holmes really did was inductive, not deductive reasoning. Anyway, scientists form ideas, theories, hypotheses through deductive reasoning. Hypotheses are then tested through empirical observations, and scientists form conclusions through inductive reasoning. These conclusions lead to new theories and hypotheses, or more broad generalizations, which oftentimes starts the process all over again. The scientific method. Scientists use inductive reasoning to form theories which then generate hypotheses. A theory is a well-developed set of ideas that propose an explanation for observed phenomena. A hypothesis is a tentative and testable statement, prediction, about the relationship between two or more variables. Hypotheses predict how the world will behave if the theory is correct. They are usually an if-then statement, although they don't have to be, and they are falsifiable, capable of being shown to be incorrect. The scientific method of research includes proposing hypotheses, conducting research, and creating or modifying theories based on results. Many of the specifics of Freud's theories, such as his division of the mind into id, ego, and superego, have fallen out of favor in recent decades because they are not falsifiable. In broader strokes, his views set the stage for much of psychological thinking today, such as the unconscious nature of the majority of psychological processes. In this section, we will cover approaches to research, which include clinical or case studies, naturalistic observation, surveys, archival research, and longitudinal and cross-sectional research. Clinical or case studies. Clinical or case studies focus on one individual. The studied individual is typically in an extreme or unique psychological circumstance that differentiates them from the general public. It allows for a lot of insight into a case. It's difficult to generalize results to the larger population. In other words, what we find within the case study may not necessarily apply to the larger population. Our example is Jeannie. Jeannie was studied by psychologists after she was found at age 13, having suffered severe abuse and social isolation. Psychologists were interested in the effect social isolation had on her development. Naturalistic observation is the observation of behavior in its natural setting. Naturalistic behavior is generally hidden under scrutiny or observation. Seeing a police car behind you would probably affect your driving. To study the most accurate and genuine behaviors, naturalistic observation has proven most effective. Through naturalistic observations, any feelings of performance or anxiety of the studied individual is eliminated. However, there can be observer bias, which is when observations may be skewed to align with observer expectations. Establishment of clear criteria to observe should help eliminate observer bias. Jane Goodall made a career of conducting naturalistic observation of chimpanzee behavior. Surveys are a list of questions that can be delivered in many ways: paper and pencil, electronically, or verbally. Surveys can be used to gather a large amount of data from a sample, which is a subset of individuals from a larger population. Surveys can be administered in a number of ways, including electronically administered research, like the survey shown here. Archival research uses past records or data sets to answer various research questions or to search for interesting patterns or relationships. A researcher doing archival research examines records, whether archived as hard copy or electronically. Longitudinal and cross-sectional research. Cross-sectional research compares multiple segments of a population at a single time, such as different age groups. Longitudinal research studies are when the same group of individuals is surveyed or measured repeatedly over an extended period of time. For example, if I were interested in common lingo or slang words used by school-aged children, teenagers, and adults, I could conduct a cross-sectional study in which I asked people in those three age groups what the most common lingo or slang was they use today. I would gather a lot of information in a short period of time. Longitudinal research, on the other hand, would mean that I would start out with a group of school-aged children and ask them what the most common lingo or slang was that they used right now. When they are teenagers, I would ask them that question again. Finally, as adults, I would ask that question a third time. With longitudinal research, I could possibly see the evolution of slang or lingo, but it would take a long time. Researchers often expect some participants to drop out of studies, especially ones that take a long time, like a longitudinal study, so they often initially recruit a large group of participants. Attrition refers to the reduction in the number of research participants as some drop out over the study over time. A lot of psychological research is correlational. A correlation is a relationship between two or more variables. When two variables are correlated, one variable changes as the other does. They correlate. The correlational coefficient is a number from -1 to +1, indicating the strength and direction of the relationship between variables, and usually represented by lowercase letter r. A positive correlation is when two variables change in the same direction, both becoming either larger or smaller. This is noted in graph A. A negative correlation is when two variables change in different directions, with one becoming larger as the other becomes smaller. This is indicated in graph B. Graph C shows us that a negative correlation is not the same thing as no correlation, because no correlation shows no distinct relationship between the two variables. Scatter plots are a graphical view of the strength and direction of correlations. The stronger the correlation, the closer the data points are to a straight line. With the correlational coefficient, the stronger the correlation, the further the number is away from 0, or the closer it is to either -1 or +1. An example of a positive correlation could be, the more you study, the higher your grade on your psychology test. It is also a positive correlation to say, the less you study, the lower your grade on your psychology test, because in both examples, the amount of time spent studying and the grade on the test increase or decrease together. With a negative correlation, remember they're moving in opposite directions. So, the more time you spend on Instagram, the lower your grade on your psychology test. Or, the less time you spend on Instagram, the higher your grade on your psychology test. An example of no correlation would be, the color of your eyes indicates your grade on your psychology test. It doesn't matter what color your eyes are. It's not going to determine your grade on the test. The most important thing you can learn about correlation is that correlation does not indicate causation. Let me say that again. Correlation does not indicate causation. In other words, just because two things are correlated does not mean that they have a cause and effect relationship, which is changes in one variable cause the change in the other variable. This can only be determined through an experimental research design. Oftentimes there is what we call a confounding variable, an unanticipated outside factor that affects both variables of interest, often giving the false impression that changes in one variable causes the change in the other variable. For example, as ice cream sales increase, so does the overall rate in crime. A relationship does exist between ice cream and crime, but is it correlational, or does it one cause the other? In this example, temperature is the confounding variable. As temperature increases, ice cream sales increase, and people are also more likely to be outside, increasing crime rates. Not only do people mistake correlation for causation, but they can also make false correlations. A false correlation, or an illusory correlation, is when a person sees a relationship between two variables when in reality no such relationship exists. TV shows like to do storylines where a couple is trying to get pregnant and they're having issues with fertility, so they finally decide to adopt, and shortly after adopting, they get pregnant. In reality, there is no correlation between adoption and getting pregnant. However, something like that is somewhat ironic. It stands out, so we think it's kind of cool, so we tend to notice it. What we don't notice is when that doesn't happen, right? Another example would be you say, "Isn't it amazing? I was just thinking of my best friend and my best friend called." Well, what about all the times when you thought of your best friend and your best friend didn't call? There are a lot more of those, but it's cool when it actually happens. So we tend to focus on that, which creates an illusory correlation in our minds. Another thing that can get in the way is something called confirmation bias, which is when we tend to ignore evidence that disproves ideas or beliefs. In other words, we're just looking for the information that supports what we believe. We don't usually do this on purpose. It's actually just natural human tendency. Illusory correlations can be involved in the formation of prejudicial attitudes that can lead to discriminatory behavior. For example, many people believe that a full moon makes people behave oddly. Research demonstrates that this relationship does not exist. The only way to establish that there is a cause and effect relationship between two variables is to conduct a scientific experiment. A scientific experiment has precise requirements for design and implementation. Your experimental hypothesis can be formulated through observation and after the review of previous research. In the most basic research design, you have two groups, the experimental group and the control group. In your experimental groups, the participants experience a manipulated variable. In other words, they are going to experience what it is that the researcher thinks is important. The control group, on the other hand, has participants that do not experience a manipulated variable. They'll serve as a basis for comparison and control for chance factors that might influence the result of the study. Ideally, experimental manipulation is the only difference between the experimental and control groups, so any differences between the two are due to experimental manipulation rather than chance. A lot of times in psychology, we are measuring variables that mean different things to different people. For example, perhaps I want to study happiness, or whether the COVID-19 pandemic has caused increased depression. What do I mean by happiness? What do I mean by depression? To be able to measure these variables, I need to define them in a way that others can understand exactly what I'm trying to measure. We call that our operational definition. It's a description of what actions and operations will be used to measure the dependent variable and manipulate the independent variables. Seasons of Love is a song made famous by the musical Rent. I like Seasons of Love because I call it my operational definition song. The song asks the question, how do you measure a year? Is it 525,600 minutes? Is it cups of coffee? Is it love? These are all examples of different ways that you could operationally define the measurement of a year. When you design an experiment, you want to avoid bias and you also want to avoid the placebo effect, because both of those could end up skewing the results of your study. Experimenter bias is when the researcher's expectations inadvertently affect the study, and participant bias is basically when the participant thinks they know what the experimenter wants, and instead of actually answering the questions correctly or performing the actions correctly, do what they think the experimenter wants them to do. When we conduct a single blind study, it basically means that the researchers know which participants are in the experimental group and which are in the control group, but the participants do not. This controls for participant expectations. If you knew that you were in the control group, you might not take the research activities seriously. If you knew that you were in the experimental group, you might behave how you think you're supposed to behave since you received what is considered the independent variable, or the IV, the thing that the experimenter thinks is important. Now, a double-blind study is when in the experiment, neither the researcher nor the participants know who is in which group. It controls for both participant and experimenter expectations. Now, obviously, somebody somewhere knows who is in which group, but the person who is interacting with the participants would not know, so that you couldn't accidentally treat one group better or nicer than the other. Now, the placebo effect is when people's expectations or beliefs influence or determine their experience in a given situation. When people are given a pill to improve their mood may increase just because they believe it will. To know if a medication is really having an effect or whether it is a placebo effect, the experimental group would receive the medication and the control group would receive a placebo treatment, a sugar pill. This would be considered a double-blind study. Any differences between the groups would be due to the medication. Once again, providing the control group with the placebo treatment protects against bias created by expectancy. The two most important variables in a research study are the independent variable, or IV, and the dependent variable, or DV. The IV is the variable that is influenced or controlled by the experimenter. Hopefully, this should be the only important difference between your experimental and control groups. The experimental group would receive the IV, whereas the control group would not. They would either receive nothing or they would receive some sort of placebo. The dependent variable would be the variable that the researcher measures to see how much effect the independent variable has. While only the experimental group receives the IV, both control and experimental groups would experience the DV because those would be the results of the study. How are participants selected for psychological research? When we say participants in psychology, we mean the subjects of the research. Oftentimes, populations are too large for a researcher to include everyone, so samples are used instead. A sample is a subset of individuals selected from the larger population. The population is the overall group of individuals that the researcher is interested in. Hopefully, we can gather a random sample of participants, which is a subset of the larger population, in which every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. This kind of sampling is preferred because it's more likely that the characteristics of the sample will match the characteristics of the larger population. Now that you've been chosen to be part of the research study, how do we determine who's in the experimental or control groups? Hopefully that's determined by random assignment, which is a method of experimental group assignment in which all participants have an equal chance of being assigned to either group. These days we tend to do it using statistical software, but it could also be done by flipping a coin or pulling numbers out of a hat. This prevents systematic differences between groups such as gender or age. Without random assignment, an experiment cannot find a true cause and effect relationship. Any relationship could be due to pre-existing differences between the groups. Random assignment helps to avoid pre-existing systematic differences so that any significant differences between groups can be said to be the result of the manipulation or independent variable. When conducting psychological research, there are some issues to consider. For example, we can't always manipulate the variable. As we said before, random assignment is required to be able to state causation. Once randomly assigned, each group is then manipulated in some way. However, some experimental designs are more complicated. For the following example, let's make the assumption that sex is binary. In other words, there are only two sexes, male and female. We want to know whether the effect of sex, in other words, being male or female, has some sort of effect on spatial memory. In this case, the thing we think makes a difference, the independent variable, is sex, and it cannot be manipulated. Being male or female cannot be randomly assigned. This kind of experiment is therefore called a quasi-experiment, and a cause and effect relationship cannot be determined from this type of experiment. Another issue to consider would be ethics. Some questions cannot be answered using an experimental design because they would be unethical. For example, the effect of experiencing abuse as a child on levels of self-esteem. You cannot randomly assign participants to receive abuse, and so this would need to be studied using other approaches such as case studies or surveys. Interpreting experimental findings. Once data have been collected, a statistical analysis is conducted. When we say statistical analysis, we are trying to determine how likely any difference between experimental groups is due to chance. Psychology usually discuss the results as significant or non-significant. If the odds that the differences occurred by chance are 5% or less, then the results are considered significant. A true experiment, including random assignment, manipulation of the IV, and control of extraneous variables, reduce the odds of results occurring by chance. Once our research is complete, we need to report the findings. Usually, research is reported in scientific journals. They are usually aimed at an audience of professionals or scholars, and articles are published as peer-reviewed journal articles. A peer-reviewed journal article is an article read by several other scientists, usually anonymous, with expertise in the subject matter, who provide feedback regarding the quality of the manuscript before it is accepted for publication. This helps to weed out poorly conceived or executed studies. It improves articles with suggested revisions, and it determines whether the research is described clearly enough to be replicated by other researchers. Replication refers to doing the study again. So it determines the reliability of original research design. It can include additional measures that expand on the original findings, and it can also provide more evidence to support the original finding or to cast doubt on those findings. Once there was a study where a researcher was interested in whether he could teach a worm how to get through a maze, and then he wanted to chop that worm up, feed it to other worms, and his hypothesis was that worms who had eaten other worms who had already made their way through the maze would automatically know how to get through the maze. So he trained a worm to get through the maze, he fed it to new worms, and lo and behold, they could get through the maze on the first try. Now, the results of the study had some seriously scary implications for things like cannibalism. It could imply that if you ate someone who had knowledge of something, you would then have knowledge of that same thing. However, once researchers attempted to replicate this study, they did not end up with the same results. Thank goodness. The major change they had made to the study was, instead of having the worms all go through the same maze, they created a series of identical mazes. So each maze was exactly the same, but basically each worm got its very own maze. And it turns out the worms in the original study that were finding their way through the maze after being fed the other worm who had already been trained weren't actually figuring that out because of the fact that they had eaten the other worm. It's because they were smelling or sensing the trail that the earlier worm had left as it made it through the maze. So when each worm got its very own brand new maze, the results were not the same. Bad science and retraction, the vaccine autism myth. Many peer-reviewed publications published research making claims that routine childhood vaccines cause some children to develop autism. Since these reports, large-scale research was carried out suggesting that vaccinations are not responsible for causing autism. Many of the original studies have since been retracted. It was found that the leading research in the original study had a financial interest in establishing a link between childhood vaccines and autism. Unfortunately, the initial claims were publicized and many people still think vaccinations cause autism. Reliability and validity. In terms of research studies, when you hear the word reliability, I want you to think consistency. And when you hear the word validity, I want you to think accuracy or truth. A reliable study would get consistent, reproducible results. Would the same test give the same results every time? Do the instruments or tools used to collect the data do so in consistent, reproducible ways? If they do, then that test is reliable. When a study involves observations by multiple people, it is important that they all make observations and record them in the same way. This is what we call inter-rater reliability, the measure of agreement among observers on how they record and classify a particular event. Now, just because something is reliable and something is being measured consistently does not always mean that it is measuring something correctly. Validity, once again, refers to accuracy. Does the test measure what it is meant to measure? A valid measure is always reliable, but a reliable measure is not always valid. For example, let's say a classroom assignment for some fourth graders is to measure how many meters long a room is. So all of the kids go to the box with the meter sticks and they start measuring the room. Now, a few kids come in late and they just see people measuring things with long sticks. So they go and grab sticks out of the yard stick box and start measuring the room. Now, those measuring with the yardstick, are they measuring accurately? Are they going to get their results in terms of meters? Because the question was, how many meters long is the room? The answer is no. So those using the yardsticks would not have valid results. However, if they were to repeat the measure, in other words, measure the room multiple times, the odds are they would still come out with the same number. However, that number would be in yards, not meters. So that's an example where something is reliable. They get the same number time and time again, but it is not valid because it is not measuring what it's supposed to measure. Whenever you do research involving human participants, there becomes a question of ethics. Research involving human participants must adhere to strict guidelines. These guidelines are usually set up by the Institutional Review Board, or IRB, which is a committee of administrators, scientists, and community members that reviews proposals for research involving human participants. For the University of Hawaii, the IRB is located at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And so they do exist at all research institutions that receive federal support for research involving human participants. And generally, the IRB must approve research proposals before it can proceed. One of the most important things that an IRB does is make sure that the participants enter into the research study with informed consent. In other words, it's the process of informing a research participant about what to expect during an experiment and then obtaining the person's consent to participate. It should include potential risks involved, implications of the research, notification that participation is voluntary, and notification that any data collected will be kept confidential. Sometimes deception is necessary to prevent the participants' knowledge of the research question affecting the results, as long as it is not considered harmful. When we say deception, we are purposely misleading experiment participants in order to maintain the integrity of the experiment. If deception is involved, there must also be debriefing, which is when participants are told complete and truthful information about the experiment at its conclusion. Ethical guidelines have not always existed. In 1932, participants were recruited in an experiment studying syphilis in black men. Participants that tested positive were not informed that they had the disease. Although no cure existed at the beginning of the study, a cure was found in 1947, penicillin, but it was not administered to the participants. Many participants unknowingly spread the disease, and many died. This was the Tuskegee syphilis study. Research involving animal subjects also have ethical consideration. 90% of psychological research involving animal subjects use rodents or birds. Animals make good substitutes because many of their basic processes are sufficiently similar to those in humans. Animals are used when the research would be unethical in human participants, and researchers must still aim to minimize pain or distress. So whenever you have an institution that conducts animal research, you will often find an institutional animal care and use committee, which is essentially the IRB for research involving non-human animals. Some people protest any research done on animals because they say that animals, unlike humans, don't have the ability to consent to be in the study.